Before we begin, please like and subscribe to help me out. I won't interrupt the story again. The office smelled like stale coffee and Wyatt's sandalwood cologne, the kind that cost more per ounce than I made in an hour. He placed the document on the glass desk with deliberate slowness, his fingers leaving no prints on the polished surface. Through the window behind him I could see the employee parking structure where my Subaru had occupied the same spot for 9 years, Level 2 Section C Space 14. The spot where I'd pulled in at 6:15 every morning, before the security guard finished his first rounds. Effective next pay period, Wyatt said, adjusting his cufflinks, your annual compensation will be modified to $70,000. Sign by Friday. I lifted the document. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind with a watermark you could see when you held it to the light. They'd used premium stock for a conversation they clearly thought would last 5 minutes. My current salary, $140,000, appeared nowhere on these pages. Just the new figure and beneath it, 3 paragraphs about economic adjustments and organizational realignment for sustainable growth. The words became slightly unfocused, not from emotion, but from the HVAC system that had been broken for 6 weeks, making everything in this office feel close and suffocating. You're reducing my pay by half, I said. We're correcting compensation to reflect current benchmarks for your position level. Wyatt reclined in his chair, which was the Herman Miller kind that cost $4,000. Mine was the standard issue that made my lower back ache by noon. Honestly, Kinsley, you should appreciate that we're keeping you on at all. The entire pharmaceutical research sector is contracting. Budgets are tight everywhere. I placed the document back down and studied him properly. Wyatt Chandler had been appointed Chief Operating Officer 11 months earlier, right after the shareholders' meeting where they'd announced record-breaking revenue growth. The quarter when my compound, the one I'd spent 4 years perfecting, had received FDA approval and launched to immediate market dominance. The medication that analysts were calling the most significant breakthrough in autoimmune treatment in 2 decades. The drug that Helios Pharmaceuticals, this company, had built its entire expansion strategy around. The formulation that made us $12 million in the first month alone. What about my royalty arrangement? I asked. That was an informal understanding with prior leadership, never formalized in writing. Consider it terminated. My royalty arrangement had been 0.5% of gross revenue from any medications utilizing my research compounds. Prior leadership meant Dr. Raymond Shaw, the former VP of Research and Development who'd recruited me from Johns Hopkins 9 years ago and told me, when you develop something that changes the game, you'll participate in the upside. That's my word. Raymond had resigned 7 months ago, moved to New Zealand, started teaching at Auckland University or doing something equally distant from this glass desk and these heavy papers. The autoimmune medication uses my compound, I said. The inflammation reducer, the cellular repair treatment, all 3 products in the pipeline. Those are company assets developed using company facilities during company hours. Wyatt glanced at his smartwatch. Listen, we're finished here. Sign the acknowledgement section and payroll will implement the adjustment. Or decline and we'll process your termination. Your decision. I stood. My chair made no sound because they'd finally replaced it last month. I collected the document and left Wyatt sitting there with his watch and his sandalwood cologne. My laboratory was on the 3rd floor, which was actually a converted quality control space that someone had renovated with white epoxy floors and stainless steel countertops. It smelled like ethanol and the particular kind of quiet that exists in spaces designed for precision. My workstation was exactly as I'd organized it that morning. Pipettes arranged by volume capacity, my research journal open to the calculations where I'd been optimizing binding affinity for a new molecular target. The journal was mine. Purchased it myself from a medical supply catalog 4 months before I'd even applied to Helios. Black leather cover, acid-free pages. Every compound I'd ever synthesized was documented there, written in my notation system, derived from research I'd initiated during my doctoral dissertation. The autoimmune compound that was currently producing, according to last quarter's financial disclosure, approximately 67% of Helios's pharmaceutical revenue. Pages 83 through 119. Every variation, every unsuccessful trial, every successful modification. I'd been meticulous about that. 9 years ago when Raymond had hired me, I'd studied the employment agreement carefully. Most pharmaceutical companies included intellectual property provisions claiming ownership of any discoveries made using their equipment, their funding, their resources. Standard industry language. But my compounds had been synthesized before I'd signed any agreements. My dissertation at Johns Hopkins had focused on small molecule inhibitors for inflammatory pathway modulation. I'd brought that expertise with me. Everything I'd accomplished at Helios was an extension of principles I already understood. The company owned the right to manufacture the medications I'd helped develop. They didn't own the underlying compounds themselves. That distinction, hidden in contract language most people never examined carefully, was about to become extremely relevant. I photographed every page of my research journal. Required 53 minutes. Then I collected my personal belongings into a cardboard box from the recycling area. The small cactus Raymond had given me when I'd successfully stabilized the primary compound. My spare lab coat, the mug that said, "I have a PhD in chemistry, don't test me." On my way out, I stopped by Human Resources and left the unsigned document on Carol's desk. "Tell Wyatt I'm resigning," I said. Carol looked up from her monitor, perplexed. "Resigning for today?" "Resigning from Helios, effective immediately." I drove home with the box beside me, my research journal in my bag. It was 3:45 in the afternoon on a Thursday in April. The sky was clear, the kind of California clear where everything looks sharp-edged and unforgiving. My apartment was in a complex near the highway, the kind of building with exterior staircases and a gym that smelled like mildew because the ventilation never worked properly. I made tea and opened my laptop. The non-competition clause in my employment agreement prevented me from accepting positions with direct competitors for 24 months. It said nothing about licensing intellectual property I personally owned. It didn't prohibit me from selling compounds. That oversight, which Wyatt and whoever had written the contracts had apparently never considered important, was substantial enough to matter. I spent 4 hours researching. By 8 o'clock I had compiled a list of 19 pharmaceutical companies that might value what I possessed. By 9:30, I'd narrowed it to 4 that had both the financial capability to make a serious offer and the market position to genuinely threaten Helios. By 10:15 I was composing an email to Dr. Catherine Wells, Executive Vice President of Research at Vanguard Therapeutics. Vanguard was Helios's worst nightmare. They had FDA relationships, they had distribution infrastructure, they had hospital partnerships. What they lacked was a breakthrough autoimmune medication that could compete with our compound. They'd attempted to develop one, failed. Attempted to acquire smaller biotech firms with promising research, failed. Their stock had declined 9% last quarter specifically because industry analysts doubted their ability to compete in the autoimmune treatment market. I kept the email brief. Dr. Wells, I'm Kinsley Hayes, formerly Senior Research Scientist at Helios Pharmaceuticals. I've developed a small molecule inhibitor for autoimmune conditions that's currently generating 67% of Helios's revenue. My employment ended today and I retain ownership of the foundational intellectual property. If Vanguard is interested in exclusive licensing rights, I'm available to discuss arrangements. I sent it at 10:38. Not anticipating a response until the following day at the earliest. She replied at 11:04. Can you be at our Boston headquarters tomorrow at 3? The Vanguard building was modern glass and concrete, 32 floors on Atlantic Avenue with views of the harbor. Security issued me a visitor credential. The elevator was the silent kind where you become aware of your own heartbeat. Catherine's office was on the 29th floor, and she met me at the reception area herself rather than sending an assistant. She was perhaps 55, short gray hair, wearing a white coat over a navy dress. "Kinsley," she said, shaking my hand firmly. "I appreciate you coming on short notice. Let's talk in the research facility." Not the conference room. The research facility. That communicated something important. Vanguard's R&D department occupied 3 floors. It smelled correct, that combination of chemical precision and controlled air you can't replicate. Catherine guided me to a private section with a fume hood and a mass spectrometer that was more advanced than anything Helios possessed. "Show me," she said. I opened my research journal to page 83. This is the foundational structure for the autoimmune inhibitor. Small molecule design with a proprietary binding mechanism using a modified heterocyclic core. The critical innovation is the selectivity enhancement here. I indicated the section where I'd resolved the off-target binding issue that had defeated 4 other researchers, and the metabolic stability improvement here. Most small molecules in this class degrade too rapidly in vivo. This one doesn't. Catherine examined the pages, her finger following the molecular structures. She was genuinely reading them, not performing. You developed this when? The initial structure was part of my doctoral dissertation at Johns Hopkins. I refined it after joining Helios, but the foundational work predates my employment there. And you can demonstrate that? My dissertation is archived with the university, dated 5 months before I signed with Helios. The employment agreement grants them manufacturing rights for any compounds I provide, but it doesn't transfer ownership of underlying intellectual property I developed independently. Catherine looked up from the journal. You've consulted an attorney? Not yet. I left Helios 36 hours ago. She smiled slightly. We should arrange that. Come with me. The conference room on the 30th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor. Catherine introduced me to 3 people. Aaron Griffin, Chief Legal Officer, Amanda Ford, Senior Vice President of Product Development, and Christopher Vance himself, CEO and founder's son, current head of the company. Christopher was younger than I expected, maybe 45, with the kind of relaxed confidence that comes from generational wealth. Ms. Hayes, he said, Catherine tells me you might have a solution to a significant challenge we're facing. I explained the situation. The compounds, the revenue they generated, the fact that Helios had just reduced my salary by half and eliminated my royalty arrangement without understanding what they were losing. I kept my tone professional, factual, just information. Gregory, the attorney, made notes on his tablet. You're confident about the intellectual property ownership? He asked. The foundational compounds predate my employment. Everything in my dissertation, which is publicly accessible, establishes prior art. Helios has manufacturing rights through our previous agreement, but that agreement didn't include a transfer of ownership clause for IP I brought with me. Previous agreement? I resigned today. No longer bound by their employment terms. Amanda leaned forward. What exactly are you proposing? Exclusive licensing rights to all current compounds and any future developments. You manufacture and commercialize, I provide the science and ongoing research support. In exchange, I want upfront payment plus royalties on net revenue. Christopher tapped his pen against the table. What kind of upfront payment? I'd spent most of the flight from California calculating this number. Too high, they'd reject it. Too low, I'd be undervaluing my own work. 15 million plus 6% of net revenue from any products using my compounds. The room became quiet. Amanda looked at Catherine. Catherine looked at Christopher. Gregory continued writing notes. Christopher said, What's your timeline? When could you begin working with our team? Immediately. I have everything documented. The compounds are ready for clinical trials. You could have products approved within 18 months if you move efficiently. And Helios will notice. When they attempt to scale production for their next manufacturing run and realize they don't actually own what they've been selling. Christopher smiled. Give us 15 minutes. They left me in the conference room with water that came in glass bottles with the Vanguard logo. Through the window I could see ships moving through the harbor. My phone vibrated. A text from Carol in HR. Wyatt needs to know if you're reconsidering the offer. Please respond. I turned my phone face down. 20 minutes later they returned. Christopher sat across from me. 12 million upfront, 7% royalties, and you join Vanguard as Director of Molecular Research with a base salary of $220,000. We move as quickly as our legal team can prepare the documentation. I calculated rapidly. If Vanguard could capture even 40% of Helios's market share with my compounds, 7% of that revenue would be substantial, significantly more than I'd been making in salary and royalties combined. And I'd have a proper laboratory, proper resources, proper respect. I'll need my own attorney to review everything, I said. Absolutely. Gregory can recommend someone if you'd like. Someone not affiliated with either company. I shook Christopher's hand. Let's proceed. The following 4 days were intensive legal work. The attorney Gregory recommended, Lisa Brennan, was a partner at a firm specializing in pharmaceutical intellectual property disputes. She spent hours reviewing my dissertation, my research journal, my employment agreement with Helios. On the fourth day she called me to her office. "This is sound," she said. "Your dissertation establishes clear prior art. The employment agreement doesn't include specific language claiming ownership of IP you developed before joining. They have manufacturing rights, but those rights don't prevent you from licensing the same compounds elsewhere. The non-competition clause prohibits you from direct employment with competitors, but you're not a traditional employee of Vanguard. You're a licensor who happens to also have a research position. The distinction matters legally." "So we're protected?" "Legally, yes. Practically, Helios is going to be extremely unhappy when they understand what happened. Expect litigation." "Let them litigate." On day 6 I signed the agreements. Vanguard's wire transfer appeared in my account at 3:17 in the afternoon. $12 million. I sat in my apartment staring at my phone at the number that seemed abstract. Then I forwarded my new contact information to Carol at Helios HR, officially concluding my employment relationship. Wyatt called at 5:30. I let it go to voicemail. He called again at 5:47, again at 6:03. At 6:42 he sent an email. "Kinsley, we need to discuss your departure. There are concerns about proprietary information. Please contact me immediately." I didn't respond. The first indication that Helios had noticed the problem came 10 days after I'd signed with Vanguard. Catherine forwarded me an email from one of her contacts at a contract research organization. Helios just submitted an urgent request for someone who can reverse engineer their autoimmune compound. Apparently, their documentation is incomplete and they're experiencing formulation issues with their current batch. I smiled. The formulation issues would be because they didn't understand the precise stereochemistry that made the compound work. You couldn't just synthesize the ingredients and expect results. The binding mechanism required exact configurations, specific reaction conditions, particular purification sequences. Without my notes, they were guessing. By day 14 I was established in my new laboratory at Vanguard. Real space, real equipment, a team of 4 research associates who actually listened when I explained concepts. We began reformulating the compound for Vanguard's manufacturing specifications immediately. Catherine had expedited everything. Regulatory affairs was already preparing IND applications. Business development was organizing meetings with their hospital network partners. On day 22, Helios's attorneys sent a cease and desist letter to Vanguard. I sat in Gregory's office while he read it aloud. They're claiming misappropriation of trade secrets, breach of employment obligations and corporate espionage. They want all compounds destroyed and they're threatening to pursue injunctive relief. Can they succeed? I asked. They can try. Discovery will be enlightening for them. We'll need to provide your dissertation, your research journal, your employment agreement. All of which demonstrate you own this IP before they ever encountered it. Gregory looked up from the letter. They're going to argue that any modifications you made while employed belong to them. The modifications were applications of the foundational science and I made those modifications using knowledge I already possessed. They can't claim ownership of my education. That's exactly what we'll argue. The litigation started officially on day 29. Helios filed in federal district court seeking emergency injunction to prevent Vanguard from using misappropriated compounds. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning 9 weeks out. Lisa handled everything but she kept me informed. They're struggling, she told me. Their filings are emotional, not substantive. They're hurt and angry but they don't have a case. During this period, Vanguard's product development moved forward. We'd reformulated the compound to be superior to the Helios version. More selective, better bioavailability, enhanced safety profile. Catherine was impressed. This is remarkable work, she said, reviewing the preclinical data. Better than anything we've ever developed internally. By week 8, Vanguard had clinical-grade material. By week 9 they had a name, Restor Plus Advanced Autoimmune Treatment. Marketing had conducted patient focus groups. The response was exceptional, preferred over Helios's product in blinded comparisons. The injunction hearing happened on a Tuesday morning that smelled like rain. The courthouse was Federal District in Boston, old building with marble columns and wood-paneled courtrooms. I sat behind Lisa and Gregory at the defendant's table. Wyatt was there in the gallery watching. He looked tired. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Helios's attorney argued that regardless of when the foundational compound was synthesized, I'd optimized it using their resources and therefore they owned all variations. Lisa countered by walking the judge through my dissertation page by page, demonstrating how every optimization was actually just an application of principles I'd already established. She presented my research journal with dated entries and timestamps. She presented the employment agreement highlighting the absence of any IP transfer language. The judge, an older man named Robert Harding, listened attentively. When both sides had finished, he asked Helios's attorney a single question. Can you show me any document where Ms. Hayes transferred ownership of her pre-existing intellectual property to your client? The employment agreement implicitly. Implicitly isn't explicitly, counselor. Do you have a signed IP assignment? No, Your Honor, but... Then I'm denying the motion for injunction. The preliminary evidence suggests Ms. Hayes retained ownership of her foundational work. This court will not prevent her from licensing property she appears to own. If your client wishes to pursue damages, you may do so in the full trial, but there will be no emergency relief today. The gavel came down at 2:18. I walked out of the courthouse into rain that had finally started falling. Lisa was smiling. That's decisive. They'll withdraw the suit. They can't win discovery and they know it now. He was correct. Helios withdrew their complaint 3 weeks later, quietly with no public statement. By then Vanguard was in full development. Restroplus launched Phase 3 trials in October, 7 months after I'd walked out of that office where Wyatt had placed the document on the glass desk. The trial results were outstanding. Medical journals called it transformative. Patients who'd been using Helios's medication switched. Within 12 weeks, Restroplus had captured 23% of the autoimmune treatment market based purely on trial data. Helios's market share dropped to 11%. Their stock price fell 29% in a single quarter. Wyatt was terminated in December. I saw it in a press release. Leadership transitioned to address recent strategic challenges. They promoted someone from finance to take his position. It didn't help. Without their flagship product performing, without the innovation pipeline I'd been providing, they were just another mid-tier pharmaceutical company with good marketing and nothing special in the bottles. I was in my laboratory at Vanguard when Catherine brought me the annual revenue report. Your royalties just processed, she said. Check your account. I checked. $3.1 million. 7 months of revenue, 7% of it. The number sat there on my phone screen, real and solid. Catherine sat on the stool next to my workbench. Christopher wants to discuss expanding your role. More research autonomy, larger team, additional projects. Interested? Yes, I said. Good, because you've transformed this company. We're developing treatments we never could have developed before. You made that possible. I thought about Wyatt, about that office, about the document with the $70,000 salary and the words signed by Friday. About how he checked his smartwatch while reducing my income by half. How he'd eliminated my royalty arrangement with a single sentence. How he'd assumed I had no options and no leverage. He'd been wrong about what I'd brought to Helios, wrong about what I owned, wrong about what would happen when you treat someone like they're replaceable and discover too late that they weren't. I returned to my workbench, to the new compound I was developing. Something superior to Restroplus. Something that would make Vanguard not just competitive but dominant. Outside the window, Boston was gray and rainy and full of possibility. My tea had gone cold, but I didn't care. I had work to do. The weeks after the hearing fell into a rhythm. I'd arrive at Vanguard at 7 in the morning before the research associates started their shifts, when the laboratory was still quiet except for the hum of the refrigeration units and the occasional beep from the automated systems. The building smelled different than Helios had. Cleaner somehow, with better air circulation. The coffee in the break room was actually good, not the burnt cafeteria sludge I'd tolerated for 9 years. My team was small but capable. 4 research associates. Emily, who'd done her postdoc at Stanford and specialized in synthetic organic chemistry. Matthew, who had a background in molecular modeling and could predict binding interactions before we even touched a beaker. Lauren, who'd worked in industry for 15 years and knew every regulatory requirement by heart. And James, fresh out of graduate school from MIT, brilliant with analytical techniques. They listened when I explained concepts. They asked intelligent questions. They didn't waste time with office politics or territorial behavior. I realized during my third week, the first time in my career I'd actually enjoyed managing people. The key to this compound class, I explained one morning, standing at the whiteboard in our small conference room, is understanding that the binding pocket has a very specific geometry. Most researchers try to force the molecule to fit. We're designing molecules that complement the pocket's natural shape. Emily nodded, making notes. Like a key and lock. More like a hand and glove. There's flexibility, but only within certain parameters. Matthew pulled up a molecular model on his laptop, rotating it three-dimensionally. If we modify the substituent here, he pointed to a side chain, we could increase the hydrogen bonding without affecting the overall conformation. Try it, I said. Run the simulations first, then if it looks promising, we'll synthesize it. This was what research was supposed to feel like. Collaborative, focused, building something meaningful. At Helios, I'd spent half my time in budget meetings and compliance reviews, defending my work to people who didn't understand it. Here, Catherine trusted me to manage my own priorities. Christopher checked in occasionally but never micromanaged. They'd hired me for my expertise and actually let me use it. By November, we had 3 new compound variations in development. The original Restor Plus was performing exceptionally in trials, but I was already thinking ahead. The autoimmune treatment market was vast, multiple conditions, different patient populations, opportunities for specialized formulations. One compound I was developing targeted rheumatoid arthritis specifically, with modifications that enhanced joint tissue penetration. Another focused on inflammatory bowel disease, with a different metabolism profile that concentrated in intestinal tissue. The third was experimental, an entirely new mechanism that might work for conditions the first generation couldn't touch. Catherine reviewed my progress reports with genuine interest. "This is ambitious," she said one afternoon, sitting in my office with the preliminary data. "If even 2 of these work, we'll dominate the sector." "All 3 will work," I said. "The chemistry is sound." "You're confident." "I'm careful. There's a difference." She smiled. Helios should have appreciated that. I'd stopped thinking about Helios daily, though occasionally something would remind me. A news article about their declining stock price. A colleague mentioning they'd laid off 30% of their research staff. A LinkedIn update showing someone I'd worked with had left for another company. Wyatt had disappeared from the industry entirely after his termination. I'd heard through the network that he'd moved to Denver, taken a position at a consulting firm, something outside pharmaceuticals. The rumor was that Helios's board had made the non-compete terms of his severance so restrictive he couldn't work for any biotech company for 5 years. Essentially exiled from the field. I didn't feel satisfaction about that exactly. More like a distant acknowledgement that consequences existed. The winter holidays approached. Vanguard closed the offices for 10 days, something Helios had never done. I spent the time in California visiting my sister, who'd been asking questions about my career change for months. "So you just left?" Rachel asked over dinner at her house in Sacramento. "Just walked out. I resigned. There's a difference. After they cut your salary in half. After they demonstrated they didn't value my contributions." Rachel, who taught high school chemistry and had never worked in industry, shook her head. "I would have been terrified. No job, no plan." "I had a plan. I just executed it quickly. And now you're making." She gestured vaguely. "Significantly more than before. Plus I own part of what I create. That's incredible. I'm proud of you." She paused. "Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. Happy wasn't a metric I typically used. Satisfied, productive, engaged, those were words that made sense. But happy? "Yes," I said, realizing it was true. "I think I am." When I returned to Boston in January, the Phase 3 trial results for Restor Plus were finalized. The data was better than we'd hoped. 68% reduction in disease activity compared to 43% for the leading competitor, which was Helios's medication. The safety profile was clean. The FDA approval seemed almost certain. Catherine scheduled a company-wide meeting to announce the results. The entire Vanguard staff, nearly 800 people, gathered in the main auditorium. Christopher presented the data with obvious pride. "This represents the future of Vanguard," he said, the slide behind him showing the efficacy graphs. "We're not just competing anymore. We're leading." Afterward, several people I'd never met approached me to offer congratulations. The recognition felt strange, different from anything I'd experienced at Helios. There, my work had been anonymous, buried in departmental reports and credited to the company broadly. Here people knew my name, understood what I'd contributed. Dr. Hayes, a young man from the regulatory department, said, "I just wanted to say the work you're doing is why I wanted to work in pharmaceuticals. To actually help people." "Thank you," I said, unsure how else to respond. That evening, Catherine invited me to dinner at a restaurant overlooking the harbor. Gregory and Amanda joined us. It was celebratory but also strategic, discussing the next phases of development, the commercial launch timeline, the expansion of my research team. "We're planning to double your budget for next fiscal year," Amanda said, reviewing numbers on her tablet. "Christopher wants you to have whatever resources you need." "I'll need additional lab space," I said. "The 3 new compounds are at different development stages. We need separation to avoid cross-contamination." "Done. We're renovating the 27th floor. It'll be ready by March." Gregory raised his wine glass. "To Kinsley, who transformed this company in less than a year." They drank. I did too, though the praise made me uncomfortable. I'd simply done what I knew how to do, taken what belonged to me and used it properly. The success wasn't surprising, just logical. But sitting there with colleagues who respected my work, in a city I was beginning to know, with financial security I'd never had before, I understood that something fundamental had changed. Not just my employment or my bank account. My perception of my own value. Helios had taught me I was replaceable, expendable, worth only what they decided to pay me. Leaving had taught me the opposite. I wasn't valuable because someone else said so. I was valuable because of what I knew, what I could create, what I brought to the work. That understanding felt like something I should have learned earlier, but perhaps you only learn certain lessons through difficulty. The FDA approved Restor Plus in March, ahead of the projected timeline. The approval came on a Wednesday morning, and Catherine called me directly rather than sending an email. "We're approved," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Full approval, no restrictions, all indications we applied for." That's excellent news. Commercial launch is scheduled for May 1st. Sales is already booking orders. The projections are extraordinary. The official launch happened on a Tuesday, coordinated across multiple markets simultaneously. Vanguard had spent months preparing, training sales representatives, educating physicians, developing patient support programs. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within the first week, Restor Plus captured 18% of new prescriptions in the autoimmune treatment category. By week 2, 26%. Patients were switching from existing medications, physicians were changing their prescribing habits, insurance companies were adding it to their formularies. Helios's market share collapsed. By June, they dropped to 6% of the market, down from the 67% they'd held when I'd worked there. Their stock price had fallen so far that analysts were speculating about bankruptcy or acquisition. I watched this happen with detached interest, the way you might observe a storm from inside a secure building. It wasn't personal anymore. It was just market dynamics, competitive advantage, the natural result of poor strategic decisions. My royalty payments from Vanguard arrived quarterly. The first payment after launch was $8.6 million. The second was $11.3 million. The numbers had ceased to feel real, existing more as abstract confirmations of value than actual wealth I could conceptualize. I bought a house, finally, a small place in Cambridge near the river with good light and a space I converted into a home office. I bought a new car, nothing extravagant, just a reliable sedan that didn't require constant maintenance. I donated to my former graduate program at Hopkins, funding fellowships for chemistry students. Mostly though I worked. The 3 new compounds were progressing through development. The rheumatoid arthritis formulation looked particularly promising, showing even better results than Restor Plus in animal models. We were preparing IND applications to begin human trials. My team had expanded to 12 people, occupying the renovated laboratory space Catherine had promised. We'd established a rhythm, a culture of careful experimentation and thorough documentation. Several universities had contacted me about collaborative research projects. Industry conferences invited me to speak. I was, in ways I hadn't anticipated, becoming prominent in my field. Not famous, exactly, but known among people who understood the work. Respected. One afternoon in August, I received an unexpected email. The sender was Raymond Shaw, my former mentor from Helios, the one who'd moved to New Zealand. Kinsley, I heard about your success with Vanguard. Congratulations on the Restra Plus approval and everything you've accomplished. I wanted to reach out because I owe you an apology. When I retired, I should have formalized your royalty arrangement properly, put it in writing, protected you from exactly what happened. I was careless and you paid the price. I'm sorry. I hope things have worked out despite my failure. Best, Raymond. I read the email 3 times. The apology was unnecessary in a sense. If Raymond had formalized the arrangement, I might never have left Helios, never gone to Vanguard, never achieved what I'd achieved. His failure had inadvertently created opportunity. But the acknowledgement mattered. Someone understanding what had gone wrong, taking responsibility for their part in it. I wrote back, Raymond, thank you for reaching out. You didn't fail me, the system failed both of us. You taught me to value my work properly, and that lesson served me well when I needed it most. I hope you're enjoying New Zealand. Kinsley. Short, professional, truthful. He replied within hours with photos of sheep and mountains and a laboratory at the university where he was teaching. He looked happy. That pleased me more than I expected. The autumn brought new challenges. A competitor company announced they were developing their own autoimmune treatment, licensed from a European research institute. The molecule was structurally different from mine but targeted the same biological pathway. If their trials succeeded, we'd have genuine competition again. Catherine called a strategy meeting. This changes our timeline, she said, the competitive compound structure displayed on the screen. We need to accelerate the development of your second-generation compounds. Accelerating means taking risks with the science, I said. We can't skip steps. I'm not suggesting we compromise the work. I'm suggesting we prioritize resources, add personnel, run parallel studies instead of sequential ones. That's expensive. Less expensive than losing market position. He was right, of course. We restructured the development plan, hired 8 additional research associates, contracted with 3 external laboratories to run parallel studies. My budget doubled again. The pace intensified. By December, the rheumatoid arthritis compound was ready for phase 1 trials. We'd completed all the required preclinical work, submitted the IND application, received FDA clearance to proceed. The first patient was dosed on December 15th, a Tuesday morning in a clinical research facility in Philadelphia. I wasn't there for the dosing, didn't need to be. But I monitored the results remotely, checking the safety data as it came through. The compound was well tolerated. No adverse effects. Preliminary pharmacokinetic data looked exactly as the models had predicted. This is going to work, Emily said, reviewing the results with me in the laboratory. The second generation is going to be even better than the first. One patient, I cautioned. Let's wait for the full cohort before we celebrate. But privately I agreed. The science was sound. The holidays approached again, my second winter at Vanguard. The company held an elaborate celebration at a hotel in downtown Boston, the kind of event where people wore formal attire and the wine came from bottles with French labels. I attended reluctantly, uncomfortable with social gatherings that served no clear purpose. Christopher found me standing near a window watching snow fall over the city. Avoiding the crowd? He asked. Observing it. He laughed. You've made Vanguard $3 billion in 18 months. You're allowed to enjoy the party. I prefer the laboratory. I know. That's why you're good at what you do. He paused, swirling his wine. We're planning an expansion. New research institute, dedicated entirely to inflammatory disease. I want you to lead it. Chief Scientific Officer position, full autonomy, whatever budget you need. I looked at him. That's a significant role. You've earned it. Think about it, let me know after the new year. He walked away before I could respond, leaving me with the offer and the snow and the distant sound of people celebrating success I'd created. Chief Scientific Officer. Leadership of an entire research institute. Complete autonomy. It was everything I'd never known I wanted until it was offered. I went home that night and sat in my house with tea and silence, considering the trajectory of the past 18 months. From a laboratory in California where my value was being cut in half to a leadership position at a major pharmaceutical company. from fighting for recognition to being offered control of an entire research division. The change wasn't just professional. I'd learned something about negotiation, about knowing what you owned and refusing to give it away for nothing. About walking away when the terms were unacceptable. About understanding your worth independent of what others were willing to pay. Those lessons had value beyond salary and royalties. They'd changed how I approached every interaction, every decision. I accepted Christopher's offer in January. The announcement went out company-wide. Kinsley Hayes appointed Chief Scientific Officer and Director of the Vanguard Institute for Inflammatory Disease Research. My salary increased to $400,000 annually, plus continued royalties on all products using my compounds, plus equity in the company. The Research Institute was being built in Cambridge, a new facility designed specifically for our work. Construction would take 18 months. In the meantime, I'd operate from our existing laboratories while recruiting staff and establishing research priorities. Catherine helped me navigate the transition. The administrative work will be challenging, she warned. Budget meetings, strategic planning, board presentations. It's different from bench work. I'll adapt. You will. But remember to keep doing science. Don't let the management consume you entirely. Your value is in the research. It was good advice. I made a rule. Mornings in the laboratory, afternoons handling administrative responsibilities. I'd continue working directly on compound development, maintaining my connection to the actual science while managing the broader organization. Recruiting for the institute began in February. We needed senior researchers, postdoctoral fellows, research associates, technical staff. The response was overwhelming. My reputation had spread throughout the field. People wanted to work with me, to be part of what we were building. I interviewed personally for every senior position. 43 candidates over 3 months. The questions I asked weren't about credentials or publications. They were about how people thought, how they approached problems, whether they could handle ambiguity and failure and the slow, difficult work of real discovery. By May, we'd hired 18 senior researchers, each one exceptional. Several had left prestigious academic positions. 2 had turned down offers from major pharmaceutical companies. They came because they believed in what we were doing, because they wanted to work in an environment that valued science over politics. The Phase 1 trial for the rheumatoid arthritis compound completed in June with exceptional results. All safety endpoints met, preliminary efficacy signals stronger than anticipated. We moved immediately into Phase 2, expanding to multiple clinical sites, increasing the patient population. The inflammatory bowel disease compound entered Phase 1 in July. The experimental third compound, the one targeting entirely new mechanisms, was still in preclinical development but showing remarkable promise in animal models. Meanwhile, Restor Plus had become the standard of care for autoimmune treatment. Market share had stabilized at 62%. The medication was generating $4.8 billion annually. My royalty payments had become so large that my accountant insisted I establish a trust and diversify investments. I bought a small laboratory building near my house and donated it to a nonprofit that trained underprivileged students in science. I endowed a professorship at Johns Hopkins in chemical biology. I funded 3 graduate fellowships annually at various universities, no strings attached, just supporting young researchers who reminded me of myself at that age. The money had become more meaningful as a tool for enabling others than as personal wealth. I lived simply, worked constantly, found satisfaction in building something that would outlast me. News about Helios reached me occasionally, usually through industry publications. They'd been acquired in August by a European conglomerate, sold for parts essentially. The autoimmune division had been dismantled. Most of the research staff had been laid off. The remaining operations were being absorbed into the parent company's existing structure. Wyatt's name appeared nowhere in the announcements. He'd vanished from the industry entirely as predicted. The new owners had no interest in preserving the legacy or the people who'd mismanaged the company into irrelevance. I felt nothing about this. Not satisfaction, not vindication, nothing. It was simply information, facts about a situation that no longer involved me. The construction of the Vanguard Institute building completed ahead of schedule in October. The facility was remarkable. 70,000 square feet state-of-the-art equipment, designed specifically for the work we were doing. Laboratories with redundant safety systems, offices with natural light, collaborative spaces that encouraged interaction. We moved in gradually over 6 weeks, transferring equipment, establishing new protocols, organizing the space. My office was on the top floor, modest in size but with windows overlooking the river. I furnished it simply: desk, computer, bookshelves, a comfortable chair for reading papers. On the wall, I hung a single item: my doctoral diploma from Johns Hopkins. Not for vanity but as a reminder of where the work had started, the foundation everything else was built on. The formal opening of the institute happened in December, 3 years almost exactly since I'd walked out of Wyatt's office at Helios. The ceremony included speeches from Christopher and Catherine, remarks from several prominent researchers we'd recruited, a tour of the facilities for investors and board members. I spoke last, keeping my remarks brief. Science advances through careful observation, rigorous testing, and willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads, I said, standing at the podium in the main auditorium. This institute exists to pursue those principles without compromise. We're here to discover, to understand, to develop treatments that improve lives. Nothing else matters. The audience applauded. I stepped down, relieved to be finished with public speaking, ready to return to work. Afterward, during the reception, a young woman approached me. She was maybe 25, wearing a visitor badge, nervous. "Dr. Hayes? I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm Angela Chen. I'm a graduate student at MIT. I just wanted to say that your career has been really inspiring to me. How you left your company and started over and built all this. It's made me think differently about what's possible." I looked at her, this young researcher at the beginning of her career, and remembered being that age, unsure, trying to figure out how to navigate a field that didn't always value people like us. "The most important thing I've learned," I told her, "is that you have to know what you're worth. Not what someone else tells you you're worth. What you actually bring to the work. And once you know that, don't accept less." She nodded seriously, absorbing this. "Also," I added, "document everything. Keep your own records. Understand what you own versus what your employer owns. Those details matter." "I will. Thank you." She walked away and I watched her go, hoping she'd remember the conversation when she needed it. The first year in the new institute passed quickly. The rheumatoid arthritis compound moved through phase 2 trials with excellent results, proving significantly more effective than existing treatments. We began preparing for phase 3, the final step before FDA approval. The inflammatory bowel disease compound showed similar promise in its early trials. The experimental third compound had moved into phase 1, the data preliminary but encouraging. We'd expanded to 93 employees at the institute. The research output was extraordinary: 42 papers published in the first year, 3 patent applications filed, 2 new compounds in early development. The culture we'd built emphasized collaboration, rigor, creativity. People wanted to work there, stay there, contribute to what we were creating. My days fell into patterns. Morning rounds through the laboratories, checking on experiments, discussing results with researchers. Afternoon meetings, budget reviews, strategic planning. Evenings in my office, reading papers, analyzing data, thinking about next steps. I rarely left before 8 at night. Weekends I spent at home, reading or occasionally walking along the river, thinking about chemistry and mechanisms and possibilities. Some people might have called this life unbalanced, too focused on work. But I'd learned that balance meant different things for different people. For me, this felt right. Purposeful. Aligned with what I valued. Catherine retired in the summer, transitioning to an advisory role after 30 years in the industry. We had lunch together on her last day at a small restaurant near the Vanguard headquarters. "You've exceeded every expectation," she told me. "When I first read your email 3 years ago, I thought you might have something interesting. I didn't imagine you'd transform the entire company. You took the risk of believing me. You'd done the work. That made it easy." She paused. "What's next for you? You've accomplished more than most researchers do in entire careers." I considered the question. What was next? "There are still diseases we don't understand," I said. "Mechanisms we haven't identified. Patients who don't have treatments. The work isn't finished." She smiled. "I thought you'd say that." The rheumatoid arthritis compound, which we'd named Revivajoint, received FDA approval in November, 4 years after I'd left Helios. The approval was comprehensive, covering all the indications we'd sought, with a favorable label highlighting superior efficacy compared to existing treatments. The commercial launch was scheduled for January. Pre-orders from hospitals and pharmacies were unprecedented. Insurance companies had already added it to their formularies. Patient advocacy groups were promoting it. The projected revenue was substantial. Conservative estimates suggested $3 billion annually within 2 years. My royalty percentage on this compound was 7%, same as Restor+. The financial implications were difficult to comprehend. I was going to be extraordinarily wealthy, even by the standards I'd already reached. Generationally wealthy. The kind of wealth that created options and influence and responsibility. I met with financial advisors, established more substantial charitable foundations, planned for systematic giving to research institutions and educational programs. The money needed to be useful to enable work that wouldn't happen otherwise. On a Tuesday afternoon in December, my assistant informed me that someone from Helios had requested a meeting. Not current Helios, which barely existed anymore, but someone from the old company. Raymond Shaw, my former mentor who was visiting Boston from New Zealand. We met at a coffee shop near the Institute. Raymond looked older than I remembered, grayer, more relaxed. He hugged me, which surprised me. "Kinsley, you look good. Successful." "Hello, Raymond." We sat. He ordered tea, I ordered coffee. "I wanted to see what you'd built," he said. "I've been following your work, reading your papers. The Institute is impressive." "Thank you." I also wanted to apologize again in person this time. What happened at Helios, how Wyatt treated you, that should never have happened. I should have protected you better. You retired. You weren't responsible for what came after. I was responsible for not establishing systems that would protect you. For assuming verbal agreements would hold. I was naive. I studied him across the table. Raymond had taught me chemistry, mentored me, believed in my potential when I was young and uncertain. His failure hadn't been malicious, just human. "You taught me to value my work," I said. "That was more important than a royalty agreement. Without that foundation, I wouldn't have known what to do when things fell apart. Still, I'm sorry." "I know. And I appreciate that." We talked for 2 hours about his work in New Zealand, about the Institute, about changes in the pharmaceutical industry, about science and life and choices. It felt like closure, not of a wound exactly, but of a chapter that had needed a proper ending. When we parted, he said, "You've become exactly what I hoped you would. A real scientist, someone who advances the field. I'm proud of you." That acknowledgement meant something more than I expected. Not because I needed his approval, but because it represented continuity, connection to where I'd started, recognition from someone who'd been there at the beginning. The new year arrived. 5 years since I'd joined Vanguard, since I'd walked out of Helios with a box of personal items and a research journal full of compounds they didn't know they didn't own. RevivaJoint launched on January 15th. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within a month, it had captured 34% of the rheumatoid arthritis treatment market. Combined with Restor+, Vanguard now dominated the entire inflammatory disease sector. My quarterly royalty payment in March was $23 million from both compounds combined. The number had become meaningless in a sense, beyond any practical use for my own life, significant only as measurement of impact and reach. The inflammatory bowel disease compound was in phase 3 trials, data looking excellent. The experimental third compound had completed phase 1 successfully, moving toward phase 2. We had 4 additional compounds in preclinical development, each targeting different aspects of inflammatory disease. The Institute had become self-sustaining, generating its own momentum, attracting talent and funding and attention. My role had evolved from hands-on researcher to strategic leader, though I still spent mornings in the laboratory when possible, maintaining connection to the benchwork that remained the foundation of everything. On a Friday afternoon in April, Christopher called me to his office. He looked serious, which was unusual. "We've had an interesting approach," he said. "There's a consortium of research institutes and universities proposing a collaborative initiative on inflammatory disease. They want Vanguard to lead it, and specifically they want you to direct it. It would be a 5-year commitment, substantial funding from multiple sources, very high profile. What would it involve? Coordinating research across 20 institutions, establishing shared protocols and data systems, essentially creating a field-wide effort to accelerate discovery. It's ambitious. Probably impossible. but potentially transformative. Why me? Because you've proven you can build systems that work. Because people trust your science. Because you understand both the research and the organizational aspects. He paused. Also because you don't care about politics or credit, which makes you trustworthy in a way that's rare. I thought about it. The scope was massive, the challenges substantial. It would require skills I'd developed over the past 5 years but on a much larger scale. And it would mean less time in the laboratory, more time managing and coordinating and navigating institutional dynamics. But the potential impact was significant. If it worked, if we could genuinely accelerate discovery across the field, the benefits would extend far beyond what any single institution could accomplish. I'd need assurances about research independence, I said. No interference from funding sources or institutional politics. The science has to drive decisions. I'll negotiate those terms. And I'd continue running the institute here. The collaborative initiative would be additional, not replacement. Understood. Then yes. Let's do it. The collaborative initiative, which became known as the Inflammatory Disease Research Consortium, launched in September. The organizational work was intensive. Establishing governance structures, negotiating data-sharing agreements, developing common protocols, recruiting researchers from 20 different institutions. I traveled constantly those first months, visiting partner institutions, meeting with research teams, explaining the vision and the structure. It was exhausting but also energizing, seeing the breadth of work happening across the field, understanding how much faster we could move if we coordinated properly. By December we had the basic framework established. Data systems were coming online, shared protocols were being adopted, research teams were beginning to collaborate across institutional boundaries. It was messy and complicated and imperfect, but it was working. My 6th year at Vanguard began with both the institute and the consortium running simultaneously. I'd hired deputies to manage day-to-day operations at both, allowing me to focus on strategy and key decisions. The pace was relentless but sustainable, barely. The inflammatory bowel disease compound received FDA approval in March. We named it Restrobowel, maintaining the brand continuity. Launch was immediate and successful, capturing 28% of the market within 6 weeks. 3 compounds generating billions in revenue. Royalties that had become almost abstract in their scale. Wealth that created responsibility and opportunity in equal measure. I established a foundation, the Hayes Institute for Scientific Research, dedicated to funding early career researchers and supporting innovative projects that traditional funding mechanisms overlooked. The endowment was $200 million, generating sufficient returns to fund 15 to 20 projects annually in perpetuity. The foundation's first grant cycle received over 400 applications. Reading them, seeing the creativity and ambition of young researchers, reminded me why the work mattered. Science advanced through individuals having resources and freedom to pursue ideas. The foundation could provide that, could create opportunities that might not exist otherwise. One evening in late spring, I was working late at the institute when Angela Chin, the graduate student who'd approached me years earlier at the opening ceremony, sent me an email. She'd completed her PhD, published several significant papers, received multiple job offers. Dr. Hayes, I wanted to update you on my progress and thank you for the advice you gave me. I've accepted a position at Stanford, starting my own laboratory. I remembered what you said about knowing my worth and not accepting less. It helped me negotiate properly. I hope I can build something meaningful like you have. Thank you for the example. Angela. I replied briefly, congratulating her, encouraging her to stay in touch. But the email stayed with me. The idea that my path, my choices, my willingness to walk away and start over had influenced someone else's career. That the lessons I'd learned might help others avoid similar struggles. That seemed almost as important as the compounds and the treatments and the science itself. Changing not just what we discovered but how we approached the work, how we valued ourselves and each other, how we built systems that enabled excellence. 7 years after leaving Helios, the Inflammatory Disease Research Consortium had expanded to 38 institutions across 6 countries. We'd coordinated over 200 collaborative research projects, published 97 papers, filed 23 patent applications. The pace of discovery had genuinely accelerated. The experimental third compound I'd been developing, which targeted an entirely new mechanism, completed phase 3 trials with remarkable results. It worked for patients who hadn't responded to any existing treatments, opening possibilities for conditions previously considered untreatable. FDA approval came in November. We named it Renewacell, emphasizing the cellular repair mechanism that made it unique. The projected patient population was smaller than the other compounds, maybe 500,000 people globally, but for those patients it was transformative. Life-changing. The first patient letters started arriving within weeks of launch. Handwritten notes from people whose symptoms had improved, whose quality of life had been restored, who wanted to express gratitude. I kept them in a file in my office, reading them occasionally when the administrative work felt overwhelming or purposeless. They were reminders of why we did this, who benefited from the careful, difficult, years-long process of drug development. One letter in particular stayed with me. From a woman named Susan, 43 years old, who'd lived with severe rheumatoid arthritis for 15 years. She wrote about not being able to hold her daughter's hand, not being able to work, not being able to imagine a future without constant pain. She'd started Revivajoint 6 months earlier, and now she could do all those things again. "Thank you for giving me my life back," she wrote. I don't know how to express what that means. I read that letter multiple times, thinking about the path from my laboratory bench to this woman's hands. The years of work, the failed experiments, the careful optimizations, the clinical trials, the regulatory approvals, the manufacturing, the distribution. All of it connecting my knowledge of chemistry to her ability to hold her daughter's hand. That connection made everything worthwhile. The long hours, the difficult decisions, even the painful departure from Helios that had started everything. It had all led to this. Treatments that helped people, that reduced suffering, that created possibilities where none had existed. On a quiet Sunday afternoon in December, 8 years after walking out of Wyatt's office, I sat in my home office reviewing the year's accomplishments. 4 compounds on the market, all performing exceptionally. The institute thriving with 140 employees. The consortium expanding and accelerating discovery. The foundation funding innovative research. Papers published, patents filed, careers launched. And wealth beyond measure, more than I could spend in several lifetimes, being deployed systematically to enable more research, more discovery, more advancement of the field. I thought about Wyatt, wherever he was, whether he ever thought about that day when he'd slid the paper across the desk and assumed I had no choices. Whether he understood that his decision, his assumption about my replaceability, had catalyzed everything that followed. Probably not. People rarely understood the consequences of their actions that clearly. But I understood. I understood that value was intrinsic, not assigned. That ownership mattered, that documentation mattered, that knowing what you brought to the work gave you leverage even when you thought you had none. I understood that walking away was sometimes the right choice, that starting over could lead to something better than holding on. That respect couldn't be demanded but could be earned through excellence and integrity and refusal to accept less than you deserved. Those lessons had shaped not just my career but my understanding of how to move through the world. How to negotiate, how to assess situations, how to make decisions aligned with my values rather than fear or convention. My phone buzzed with a message from Christopher. "Board meeting tomorrow at 9, he wrote. "We're discussing the 10-year strategic plan. Your input essential." I confirmed, then returned to the document I'd been reviewing, a proposal for a new research initiative exploring combination therapies. The science was early but promising, worth pursuing. Outside my window, winter evenings settled over Cambridge. The river was dark, lights from buildings reflecting on the water. My house was warm, quiet, comfortable. On my desk, papers and journals and reports, the materials of work that remained endlessly engaging. I had work to do. Tomorrow and next week and next year. Compounds to develop, trials to design, researchers to mentor, systems to build. The work was never finished, always evolving, perpetually presenting new challenges and possibilities. That was exactly how I wanted it. The snow had started falling again, light flakes that wouldn't amount to much. I made fresh tea and returned to the combination therapy proposal, marking notes in the margins, considering angles and approaches and questions that needed answering. Somewhere in California, in what was left of Helios Pharmaceuticals, in offices that had been dismantled and reorganized and emptied of everything that had once made them significant, the consequences of underestimating someone continued to echo. But here in Cambridge, in a house by the river, in laboratories where discoveries happened daily, in institutions that would outlast us all, different consequences were unfolding. Better ones. Consequences that reduced suffering and advanced knowledge and created opportunities for others. Those were the consequences that mattered. I worked until midnight as I usually did, then slept and woke and returned to the institute at 7 as I always did. The rhythm was consistent, sustainable, aligned with purpose. This was my life now. Built from chemistry and determination and refusal to be diminished. Built from knowing what I owned and refusing to give it away. Built from walking out when the terms were unacceptable and discovering that sometimes the best opportunities exist on the other side of difficult decisions. I wouldn't change any of it. Not even the part where Wyatt had slid that paper across the desk and cut my salary in half. Especially not that part. Because that was the moment when everything became possible.